Are you looking for inspiring conversations about faith, film, and life? You're in the right place. Here's the host who knows the right questions to ask, Father Edward Looney.
Hey everybody, it's Father Edward Looney here, and I am excited to have a conversation today about near-death experiences. As a priest, death is something that I get to deal with on a pretty regular basis. Whether it's the phone call saying so-and-so is near the end, can you come and give last rites? And I still believe that there are last rites uh, in terms of anointing, offering the apostolic pardon, commending them to God. So don't let somebody tell you last rites don't exist. I think they do. And I happily celebrate them with families, with their loved one. Sometimes, as I've gathered at the bedside of someone who is dying, or maybe I'm called after they have died, people will relate experiences that they've had at that hour of death. One person whose bedside I went to after they had passed, I'd been there the night before, and then they passed, and I went back. And they said that as he took his last breath, he said the name of Jesus. And so you would think maybe in that moment, he saw the Lord Jesus himself, the one that he believed in, the one he longed for and waited for. And Jesus, as the merciful judge, came to him to bring him to everlasting life. And so near-death experiences, they happen. Their stories are popular. If you go to YouTube and type in near-death experiences, some of these stories are watched, thousands upon thousands, maybe even millions of views, because people are fascinated by this concept. And so Sophia Institute Press has a new book, Near-Death Experiences by Scott Smith. And I'm happy today to have him joining me to share more about this book and about near-death experiences and why it is that he himself took on this task of writing this book. So thanks so much, Scott, for joining me today.
Yeah, for sure, Father. Thanks for having me.
And this is a little behind the scenes, full transparency. I don't hold anything back, but we were scheduled to do this interview a few days ago, and I accidentally forgot to put it on my calendar because it had to be rescheduled from the original date, and then it just kind of got lost in my email, the new date. But as it was supposed to happen, I was there at a bedside of someone giving last rites.
Yeah.
And so I was attending to a death experience. But here's an interesting thing. And I was told this, that, the person I had been previously anointed by a different priest, they kind of rallied and they came back and they had several, months, or I don't know, a year or more. And so somebody said that to me. Well, this person, last time they were anointed, they rallied and they came back. And so person hadn't eaten for days. I went anointed and had a meal the next day. So maybe they're rallying again or something like that. But the Lord brings them close and then brings them back. And I don't know. So by the time this episode airs, who knows, maybe that funeral mass will have already been celebrated. But near-death experiences, why do they fascinate you? Why write this book?
I am particularly fascinated by near-death experiences. Uh, I think they're personally very interesting, but I think I'm worried that so many people, so many Catholics are very interested in this subject, and the only books they can really find on the subject are from non-Catholics, from, in the evangelical world, the non-denominational world. It's a very popular subject. There's they can't write enough books about it,
Yeah.
movies about it, but and Catholics are fascinated by it, so they're reading that, but they're not it's not there's nothing Catholic about it, and even the things that are distinctly Catholic about their experiences, like seeing the Blessed Mother, or having some experience with purgatory, those are, magically edited out of the books by the time they reach the larger audiences. So I think it's it's important that not only people know about the hope that is to come, or possibly what is to be avoided, but to also understand that the Catholic worldview is is alive and well in the afterlife.
Yeah, I seem to recall, a few of these titles, and I might get them wrong, but there's like 60 seconds or 60 minutes in heaven
Yeah.
or something like that. And then you had this book, Heaven is for Real, about that little
Mhm.
boy Colton. But then there was like controversy over it. And then I think he might have even recanted it, or that, they said
Right.
that this never really happened. So then, like, it almost discredits kind of our quest to discover and search for
Yeah.
these things too.
Yeah, that's right. I hadn't really thought about that aspect, that if it's done improperly, it might make people lose their faith in heaven, or their belief in purgatory and hell. And it's also, you read one of the near death experiences I cover in the book is about Sondra Abrahams, and she had a very vivid near death experience. But one of the things that she encountered were some souls in purgatory, a lot of souls in purgatory.
Oh, wow.
One of whom was an uncle of hers that had died, and it was her, that part of her family that was not Catholic, did not believe in purgatory. So here he was in one of the bottom places of purgatory with nobody to pray for him because his family didn't believe in purgatory. So
Mm.
what do you do with that? I mean, it's the great irony that the non-Catholics that don't believe in that purgatory exists, that the mercy, the God's gift of purgatory doesn't exist, that there's no one to pray for them once they're in purgatory except the Catholics that they disagreed with in life. You
Yeah,
know?
isn't that right? I've said that a lot, I've talked about that very point, especially during the month of Holy Souls. Like, it's important for us to pray for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters who have died, that if our belief in purgatory is true and real, and that there is this place, and that our prayers help people on the way to the kingdom of heaven, and having masses said and all these things, indulgences, etc., that then we need to be praying for some of these individuals who aren't having masses said. And that it's important, anytime I pass by a cemetery, whether if I know it's Catholic or not, always that eternal rest prayer for all the people there. Just because it's the right thing to do. So I love that you mentioned that we need to be praying for the souls of those who aren't Catholic, especially because they don't have that great gift of having people praying for and remembering them. So, yeah, that's a great point. So, yeah, so did you have a near death experience? Is that one of the reasons why you're interested in the topic, or you're just fascinated by it?
I'm just fascinated by it. It's funny. I think this has come up in other areas of my life. Like, I also like to write. I've written a book on historical exorcisms, and I've written on some ghost stories, that kind of stuff. I've always been fascinated by ghosts since I was a kid, and I haven't ever seen any of this. Right? I feel like God knows that I would want to have a near death experience, or want to see a ghost, and He's like, no, you just have your imagination is enough, right? I think it's kind of funny that I live in Louisiana, and I'm surrounded by some of the most haunted places, at least in
Mm.
America. Right across the river from me is the Myrtles Plantation, that people call the most haunted place on earth. And my family, we've been living in this parish in Louisiana, um, 13, 14 generations, and we're surrounded by people talking about ghosts, and my family has seen all these things. I haven't seen anything. So that's why I like to write about it, I guess, because that's as close as I'm going to get in this life.
So when we talk about near death experiences, maybe could you define what that is, just so that we all are operating from the same terminology?
Right, and that is important. And in the book, I actually went through the medical community is coming around to start to study this phenomena, because there does appear to be not just not just a real event that's happening, but something that is medically uh, it's reducible to empirical study. And they've had some very fascinating studies, the AWARE study, and now there's a second round of the AWARE study. But there's basically there's a few components to a near-death experience. So you have basically 7 different stages to a near-death experience, at least as it's medically described. And I think you, in your general literature about near-death experiences, this is the general 7 stages. So you have, first step is disembodiment, a perception of seeing, hearing apart from the physical body. So somehow you have left your physical body. This isn't necessarily like when St. John in the beginning of Revelation says, I was flung up to heaven, or, various translations of that. It's a feeling of being bodiless, right? Maybe floating or seeing your body. In the AWARE studies, it's interesting because so many people, a significant, not a large percentage, but a significant percentage of people that die do have this kind of experience. And so the medical studies on this, they put pictures on shelves in the hospital room, like laying down on the shelf. So you'd only be able to see it if you're at the top of the room. And so they could later then ask the people, what did you see on top of that shelf? Because if they're lying on a gurney in a hospital room, they're not going to see it otherwise. And that's kind of a empirical test to see, is this happening? What's happening? Okay, so that's stage 1, disembodiment.
So there's like a show. I think I watched it on Netflix. I think it was called like Saving Hope or something like that. I could be wrong. Don't quote me on the title, but it was a Canadian show. It was a medical drama, but it was like this doctor had like he was in a coma, and he basically like he roamed the halls, as this, kind of this disembodied, as you will. So this is something that even a television show has been based on.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I think a couple fiction novels as well, for sure. The so yeah, after disembodiment, it's just, the sequence. It's not just characteristics, but this is the steps that happen. The second experience is the tunnel experience. Passing through a tunnel. It's interesting because it does seem more of a modern, or at least in the last couple 100 years, that people have started identifying as a tunnel experience. So you kind of wonder if there's not a pervasiveness to that idea. And because in my book I cover ancient near-death experiences, which is interesting because in the Catholic world we have records of near-death experiences that go back the whole 2,000 years of the church. Pope St. Gregory the Great talks about them. The Venerable Bede talks about them. And then I even argue you have them in the Bible in a couple situations that I think maybe we talk about later. Those particularly fascinate me. But the tunnel experience, there's in the earlier periods, there's still some kind of transition, right? Like you're going, like your body is moving from an experience of time to an experience of timelessness. There's some kind of transition there, which now we refer to as a tunnel experience. Intense light, right? That would be the third step. That at the end of the tunnel, right? The light at the end of the tunnel. Some intense experience of light like they've never seen in their life, like a physical light. Father Chad Pasegna, Father Pasegna, he's a Passionist priest in Houston, had a near-death experience. One of the only Catholics to have have written a book about a near-death experience, modern Catholic. He talked about something. But his near-death experience followed all these steps, but his experience of seeing a being of light, of God as light, and the way grace kind of rippled through him as like a physical manifestation of grace acting. That's, I think, distinct among near-death experiences.
And isn't it interesting, like when someone is near death, the family will often tell them, walk to the light, go to the light,
Yeah.
like that's what we tell them even.
Oh, yeah, yeah, exactly. And why do we say that? Is that just because we've heard the stories, or is there something that we know about this by nature? I don't know. Church definitely hasn't spoken to that one way or the other. After that tunnel, the intense light, then you have a feeling of immense joy, of the kind of joy that you could not experience or had not experienced in life, or somehow superseding the joy you had in life, which I think would only be perfected once the resurrection of the body comes. That all this intense joy they talk about near death experience is still bodiless. And just imagine what it would be like when the experience back in the resurrection of the body, when you can experience the perfection of joy. And then one of the last stages is the life review, right? Your life passes in front of your eyes. This is for in the Catholic worldview, this is often part of the particular judgment, right? Father Stephen Shire, who had a near-death experience, that Mother Angelica interviewed him, I think in the 90s. He has since
Mm.
passed away, but remarkable story. Love to talk about him more as well. His life review, he also talks about that compelling sense of God's justice. Like you're being shown everything you've done, the good and the bad, and it's irrefutable. Like whatever judgment comes, you may not like it, but because God's justice is so obvious and so compelling, it's nothing that's to be argued with. Or at least we're not going to argue with it. We like you see in Dante's Inferno, where the souls um, are pressing to uh, go to the inferno, to go into hell because God's justice impels them. It's that kind of experience. And what's cool about Father Stephen Shire's experience is after this life review, even though he was a priest, he hadn't in his life taken seriously the supernatural quality of the sacraments of confession. And he was found in his life review, his judgment was hell.
Mm.
And then he heard this beautiful voice, right? This beautiful feminine voice come from his side. And this is the beautiful part of and just what makes it a distinctly Catholic near-death experience is that suddenly he found an advocate at his side, the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, right? The Blessed Mother. And she said, let this priest have a second chance. And so he did, and his story is remarkable.
Oh wow.
Uh, yeah. And so that's there that kind of is the next step in the sequence: encountering loved ones, encountering God, the Blessed Mother, and then the last one is decision. Sometimes you have a decision, sometimes not, to return to life or to remain where you are. And that's pretty much the 7 steps.
Wow. So, yeah, there's lots of different near death experience types, as you just articulated there. And you mentioned a few priests, you mentioned historical stories. I'm aware of at least two priests. I don't know if you have heard of their stories. And the one guy, I'm not sure if I'm going to get his last name right, but so the one is Father Rick Wendell. Are you familiar with Father Rick Wendell and his
Even
story?
your part of the country, right?
Yeah, he lives in
Yeah.
Wisconsin. Yes, yeah. So at one time I ran in Medjugorje circles, and not that I don't necessarily, but I'm not as in the Medjugorje circles as I used to be. And so, but he was a big Medj head, as I would call it. But so, so Father Rick Wendell, there was another priest. He was at St. Norbert Abbey in De Pere, Wisconsin, but I think he went back to Philadelphia, and his name was or not Saint,
Not
hopefully
yet,
one
huh?
day, right? Father John Tarangelo, I think is his name. Father
Oh.
John Tarangelo. And he has a book. And a Travis Vanden Heuvel, I think, started a publishing company, helped it like self-publish type stuff, helped him tell his story, write about his near-death experience. I think Father John has like oscillated between Norbertine life and diocesan priesthood a few different
Okay.
times,
Okay.
but yeah, so those are just two stories immediately coming to mind. I just think about some of these accounts, so and this isn't like a near death experience, but it would be like the dead coming back. And there are stories, and I know Alphonsus Liguori in The Glories of Mary recounts some of these where, like, a nun or something will come back to her community and say, please have masses said for me, or something like that. So the plea for masses from the dead. But then I remember too in the Pieta prayer book that there was a Poor Clare nun who appeared to the abbess of her monastery and said, I went straight to heaven because I paid all my debts by virtue of this prayer. And it was called the prayer for daily neglects. So it's like
Mm.
you have the dead coming back to like give a message or to warn or to help people as they make their journey to the kingdom. So like
Oh,
those wouldn't be near death experiences, but they're experiences of the dead or something like that, I guess you'd say.
yeah, and that's kind of it's been difficult for me writing this book because there's so many rich stories of that, right? Of like Saint Margaret Mary, Saint Faustina, where souls from purgatory are reaching out to them
Yeah.
for help. Um, you've got the Museum of Purgatory in Rome, where you have like hands burnt into pages of books of people reaching out from purgatory. And it's like the Catholic understanding of near death experience is so expansive, like everything in the Catholic Church. It's always bigger than you can ever imagine. And trying to narrow down what can go into this book so it all accepts it all fits in that title, Catholic near death experience, is a bit overwhelming because you've got to cut out some amazing stories. There was also the letter from hell. Have you heard of that one?
No, no.
Oh, this is a wild story. A German nun, received, she was in a retreat, I think, and this was a story recommended to me by multiple priets. Like, you need to include this. She was in retreat, and a letter was slipped under her door. And it was a letter purportedly from a friend of hers, childhood friend of hers, that was in hell, that had been forced to write her. And
Hmm.
this all sounds extreme, but it actually has an imprimatur from, I think, the early 1900s from one of the dioceses in Germany. So, I feel somewhat comfortable even talking about it because of that imprimatur and Neil Obstadt. And so, the basically this woman that had died and gone to hell, she recounts what happened in her life, how she had originally had a good childhood with the nun, and they had been good friends, and then her life just went towards materialism, got in a car accident, and now she's being forced to write this letter. She doesn't want to write this letter, but she's being compelled to do it. Um, and there you go. It's just so many stories. Um, Sondra Abrahams, who had a near-death experience that I spoke about previously, she has this experience of, and I mean, you got to watch out because, right, we can't dabble in necromancy or anything like that, or mediumship. We definitely have to stay away from that for sure. But she has souls reach out to her from purgatory, and people will come to her and be like, do you know how are my parents in purgatory? And she refuses to answer these things because that's dangerous territory. But it is interesting how she does give some practical advice for us, for lay people, that if we're wondering where our loved ones are, and definitely be praying for them, but for her and for us, when they'll come to her in her dreams or even maybe in waking, and she'll know where they are based on the radiance of their face. If they look sullen and sad versus whether they look radiant. And so I think this happens to us too when we dream about our loved ones. If we dream about our loved ones and they aren't happy, right? They're not joyful, or we don't get a feeling of joy from the experience, then we should definitely be praying for them. And probably pray for them regardless, right? Just in case we're misinterpreting the whole thing. So it's fascinating all the subjects this one subject touches on.
And how would you classify, for example, like the visionaries of Fatima, that the Blessed Mother in these visions takes them to hell and and
Wow.
other visionaries, maybe they're taken to heaven or they see purgatory. So like they have the experience of the afterlife, but they're
Mm.
not necessarily near death. Like they didn't have their foot in the world they were almost dead. But yeah, so does that qualify?
At least for this book, I've been excluding those, even though it's because a near-death experience oftentimes includes a vision of purgatory, hell, or heaven. And then you have saints like Fatima, like you said, being shown hell outside of the near-death experience. So, oh, I don't know. I guess that's going to have to be volume two because
Sure, sure.
there's so much quality material out there, but like you say, it's not. I'm trying to at least doing my best to go against my desire to tell people about these amazing stories. Don Bosco, right? All his visions. There's just the Catholic tradition, history of visionaries is it's overwhelming how massive and beautiful and expansive the visions are.
So you mentioned the Bible earlier, that you
Yeah,
think there are some near-death experiences in the Bible. Maybe you're thinking of the Old Testament, I'm not sure. Maybe you're thinking of the New Testament. But like one that immediately comes to mind, two of them, is when Jesus raises the dead.
right.
So you have the widow of Nain's son, and
Hmm.
Jesus touches the funeral bier, and that man comes back to life. You have Lazarus. Lazarus
Right.
come out of the tomb, and he comes out of the tomb. So like
Mm,
they have been dead. They,
right.
Jesus had not yet opened the gates of heaven, so they were in the place of probably Sheol, place of waiting, but
Hmm.
they've experienced death, but then Jesus brings them back. So so it wouldn't even be a near death experience. That would be like an experience of death and resurrection.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting because our modern conception of near-death experience may not always perfectly fit the mold of an experience we want to talk about. Now, the problem with the widow of Nain's son and Lazarus is that we really don't have anything. They obviously had a death or near-death experience, but we're not given any insight into what they experienced. And that I encountered a lot. Like with St. Teresa of Avila, she was dead 4 days, but then finding her describing her experiences was difficult. I eventually did find it, but um, so in the Bible, you're beset by experiences of heaven, experiences of death that maybe don't fit this category. Um, like at first, the I've had to even take some out of the book because at first included St. John and Revelation because there is some material about while in exile on Patmos that maybe it was a near-death experience and associated with
Hmm.
his vision of the apocalypse, but it's not strong enough, so I took it out.
Are you thinking
Uh,
about St. Paul, who like says like, although I was caught up or I was out of the body, and kind of giving that description?
yeah, and a lot of people will argue that that's not a near-death experience, but I argue that it is, or at least we're not far off when we say it is. And to explain why, I got to do some really interesting research into stoning in the as described in the penal code in the Mishnah. It was just fascinating. But to get to that, I would first explain what I think would be the prototypical near-death experience of the Bible, which is that of Jonah.
Okay.
All right. So this is very interesting because you have some of our current awesome Catholic Bible scholars like Dr. Petrie that argue that when Jonah was belched out of the fish onto the seashore before going to Nineveh, God says to him, arise, right? In the Hebrew, kumi, just like Jesus will use the Aramaic cognate kumi, talitha kumi, when he resurrects the girl, right? And so there's a certain association with God saying arise and resurrection. Not every time that the word arise is used in scripture do we see resurrection, of course. But even when Jesus is talking about you wicked and accursed generation, you will receive no sign but the sign of Jonah, right? Which we'll go into that in a second, that the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and rise again. But then Jesus goes on to talk about the men of Nineveh will arise and speak to this, accuse this generation, and that the Queen of the South, presumably Sheba, will arise. So, I mean, even there, he's talking about resurrection and with the word arise while referring to the story of Jonah. So I think that's kind of Jesus referring back to Jonah as being a resurrection. You see some basis for this in the church fathers. Tertullian talks about Jonah being a sign, a demonstration of God's power of resurrection. And Tertullian gets kind of gross about this. He talks about how the body of Jonah surely would have dissolved in the belly of the fish in 3 days. And so that he, not just that he would be resurrected, but that his body would be whole, right? To demonstrate God's power of that resurrection. But there's even further back in the Mishnah, there's even more about Jonah. And what's interesting about Jonah is that he talks about, in Jonah 2, there's this, he has like a canticle or a poem about his death. Like what happens, he says he descends to past the bottom of the ocean, pass under the mountains to Sheol. Like that's what he's saying. Some people might say that that's hyperbolic language, but he's saying he's going to Sheol. So that there is that evidence from Jonah's own words. But what's really fascinating about this, what made my mind explode when I was doing the research, is that the Jews thought that Jonah was also another figure in the Old Testament. And St. Jerome actually confirms this as well. The Jews believed that Jonah was actually, speaking of the widow of Nain, Jonah was actually the son of the widow of Zarephath that was resurrected by Elijah. So, I mean, doesn't that make your mind explode?
Yeah, that there's this series of generations of resurrection.
Yeah, so that would make him the only person, not counting the final resurrection, that in the Bible would have been resurrected twice. Not once, but twice. And so that's also where he received his prophetic pedigree. He became a disciple of Elisha and prophesied about Jeroboam II. And that would be Jonah's backstory. And if you go further into the Mishnah, they believe that not only was he resurrected twice, but that he just couldn't die. That was just part of Jonah's gift. maybe that he received when he was resurrected the first time. And there's a tradition in the Mishnah that Jonah was one of those that was assumed bodily into heaven ultimately, and that he just, he would not die. So that's all fascinating. I think that's incredible. But also it gives wonderful insight into Jesus's own experience, right? Because Jesus refers back to Jonah. Jesus says, "You receive no sign but the sign of Jonah." And so the reference there is that just like Jonah was dead for 3 days and resurrected, and after resurrecting led to the conversion, that his resurrection led to the conversion and repentance of a whole massive city of Gentiles, like, a huge number of Gentiles. So too, Christ will be dead for 3 days, will resurrect and lead, and this will be the fulfillment of his mission to the Gentiles, that you'll have this massive conversion of Gentiles. And I think all of that fits together just in a beautiful way. And that Jonah would have been resurrected and near-death experience, I think that just gives us a wonderful insight into just all of that.
Wow. Yeah. It gives us a biblical framework too to speak about near-death experiences, kind of to say, this
Yes.
isn't something that is just a modern phenomena, but this is something that took place way back in ancient Israel and
Yeah.
in the time of the prophets. So I think one of the reasons why we're fascinated by near-death experiences is simply because, we know something, there has to be something more to life. And what we believe as believers, as Christians, we believe that that there is something more, that there is heaven, that there is purgatory, that there is life after death. And so these stories kind of affirm that for us.
Mhm.
So, and I'm sure maybe, for a person of Jewish faith or Islamic faith, whatever, that maybe too, maybe there, I don't know if there's near-death experiences in those traditions too, or they look
Mhm.
to these for that same affirmation. But I'm just wondering, because of course there are atheists out there in the world. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in an afterlife. This is all we got, one shot, do whatever you want. It doesn't matter. Like, live your life any way you wish.
Yeah.
And so
YOLO.
how can a person like that hear stories, like the story of Father Stephen Shire that you related earlier? How could a person hear a story like that and say, I don't believe him? That's made up. Why would they reject it, or why wouldn't a person come to faith after something like this?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I write this to encourage the faith of believers, right? To quicken and to reinstill that love and desire for heaven and fear of hell. But for non-believers, any amount of evidence won't be enough. The quote. Um, I think for them, if they're gonna be only convinced by objective criteria, empirical evidence, then that I am glad that the medical community, even though the medical community is kind of going various directions, I am glad that they're studying this phenomenon to show that what we say in a religious context there is demonstrable evidence of this occurring, and a significant enough portion of the population that not just in America but worldwide and historically, that this is fundamentally a part of human nature. um the experiences, like I alluded to before, that the the medical evidence that people are seeing things that they could not possibly have seen, while all medical evidence said that they were unconscious, incapable of any kind of perception, of sensory perception, and yet nevertheless are able to describe what nurses were in the room, what medical procedures were done to them, who their doctors were, the condition of the room. Uh, if we can just begin to fan that flame for the non-believer of the supernatural, that there's something more than the natural, right? To break their minds out of this hyper empiricist, hyper materialist view that only what you can observe with your senses, that is the extent and end of reality. Once you can pierce that veil, right, we're off to the races. It may go the wrong direction. they may go towards the satanic side, but we breaking them out of a materialist worldview, I think near-death experiences are a spear shaped perfectly to pierce that veil. And as we leave the era of Christendom, sadly, as Christendom has
Yeah.
fallen and we're back in more of an apostolic age again, hopefully. The primary modes of credibility during that time for the early Christian church were prophecy and miracles.
Hmm.
And if miracles could convert the pagan Greeks, that were all about rationalism, could convert all the pagans, all the other religions, then if we can just show the miraculous side of the human experience, we can do a lot with that.
So you relate lots of different stories about these near-death experiences. You go from the Bible to
Yeah.
saints to modern contemporary people. In fact, I was reading the description of the book and saw Kevin Wells, and
Yeah.
Kevin Wells is great. I love his content. He introduced me to Venerable Al Schwartz through his book,
That book was awesome.
Priest and Beggar. Just, that book was wrecked my world in a good sense.
Yeah, I could not
um
put that down. He is such a talented writer.
yeah, I read that on a retreat, a priest retreat, actually. Just, you know decided to bring it along and just couldn't stop.
Yeah,
Just
yeah,
wanted to read it every waking minute. So
yeah.
um out of all the stories you collect, I don't know how many are in your book available from Sophia Institute Press, but which one kind of is one that you replay a lot in your mind, or you mentioned several of them already, but is there another one that just is one that is kind of, I don't know if you say your favorite or your go-to one?
Well, and you to touch on Kevin Wells's experience, I hope I don't have to do this. It's like it's so hard when you write a book. And I know how yeah, I know this experience, but I might have to take out the Kevin Wells experience because it's not truly a near-death experience because
Mm,
it was something that happened while he was unconscious, having brain surgery, or well, prior to brain surgery, when he was suffered this horrible hemorrhage, brain hemorrhage. It was an experience that the priest that was giving him the anointing, that was anointing him, and his helper, his assistant, that they experienced. They saw the heavenly court. They saw Monsignor Wells, Kevin Wells's uncle, that the slain priest that had been
mm,
murdered in his own sacristy. They came. They saw these saints and holy people come to heal Kevin, and that's an amazing story. But it's not. It's not. Kevin didn't see it,
oh,
right?
others saw it, yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, can I include this or not? I don't know. I guess we'll find out pretty soon when we see which stories all make the cut. Um, it's like I say, there's so many good stories. It's painful to have to not include. Um, but which would be my favorite? Just kind of looking over. Um, I guess to also, I go back to Sondra Abrahams a lot because I feel like a renewed devotion to praying for the souls in purgatory.
Sure, sure.
I love Father Stephen Shire's experience of the Blessed Mother.
I know
Um,
you sharing that story, kind of like if you are a Catholic priest, like I am. So if any other Catholic priest picks up this book, reads it,
yeah.
looks at these near death experiences, and sees or hears the story of Father Stephen Shire, I don't know how that doesn't make you want to take your priesthood and what you do as a priest more seriously. Like that's immediately what needs to happen. Like we can receive these things, we can, read them, but if they don't do anything for us, like if we don't change our life after hearing about a near death experience, if we don't change our life after hearing the gospel proclaimed on a Sunday, then this is all for naught. Like these things are meant to move us to a point of conversion in our life, move us to love God more. And so, I think hearing a near death experience makes me think about my own death one day. And
Yeah.
that if these people weren't ready, am I ready? And what can I do to get ready for my death?
Yeah, memento mori, right? To
Yes.
live as though our life depended on it, and it does. I think Father Stephen Shire's story is so important for other priests to hear, and there's so much more to it than what I've been even what I'm saying. And I think there's a great Mother Angelica's interview. If you end up linking to it in the show notes,
It's available
just
on YouTube, I take it.
it is, yeah, it's just readily available. He talked about how to advance, to feel like a sense of accomplishment among the priesthood and his diocese and among his friend priests. He couldn't talk about his real struggles. He couldn't talk about his struggles with the faith and really believing, or they would think, well, what's wrong with you? And he would lose his status among his brother priests. And I think it's so important for priests to hear that, that um the potential consequences of not seeking confession from brother priests. And also, one thing he said that struck me as well, because I can be a slouch when it comes to the liturgy of the hours and reading the divine office. There was an elderly priest that after in his diocese, in Father Stephen Shire's diocese, that after hearing his story and how he came back and how lucky he was to get a second chance. The elderly priest asked him, "Have you been honoring your obligations to the divine office? Have you been keeping close? Have you been reading the divine office?" Was what he asked him. It's like that's the kernel that could change everything in his priesthood. So it's amazing with these stories how they can touch people, and it's priests, it's saints, it's popes. Uh, I'm I am so struck by the Catholic story of this, which is so much greater than the way we normally hear about near death experiences. The Catholic story, the Catholics have not spoken on this. It's like we've been, and I mean, there are people have been speaking in little ways, but it's not well known. Our story and what we have to say on this subject should just be explosive. And I hope my book will just help more of these stories come out, have the greater story, the greater narrative be told.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm sure there are lots of other individuals out there who have stories. And kind of as a guy that studies Marian apparitions and evaluates and investigates, etc., like one of the things that I personally believe is that, we have a lot of very public Marian apparitions. They're public messages. We mentioned Fatima earlier, whether it's Lourdes or Guadalupe, any of those apparitions, very public. But I truly believe that there's probably, some pious lady in my parish who has had an apparition of Our Lady, and she hasn't told a soul. And
Yeah.
it's just her, and she received this message, and it brought her great comfort. And so there are lots of probably near death experience stories out there that you haven't found because they haven't told a wider audience. And so maybe it'll spark a conversation, and people share those stories, and they'll help embolden people's faith and such. So I think this is a great contribution. I think it's a book that the world will love, and I think people will gravitate towards it. We started out talking about the evangelicals, and I remember, like, I know that there was this like orange cover book. It was some doctor, and it was like his experience of death, like that was a book that was in our home when I was a kid 30 years ago. So
Imagine Heaven, maybe something like that.
yeah,
Imagine Heaven.
something like that. Yeah, maybe that's it. So, but yeah, so I think this is offering this type of literature for people of our faith, really to come to appreciate the Mary, Father Stephen Shire's story, probably stories about the Eucharist and confession and all that. Like this all ties into this. Like it makes us want to take that more seriously. So, if people want to learn more about your book, about you, where can they go? Where can they find your book and more about you?
Yeah, well, Sophia Institute. It's the book is kind of the current cover is kind of easy to find. It looks like just a giant hole on the middle of the screen, But, the covers the experience of it's the tunnel experience.
Yeah.
So
Well,
yeah,
very good. And do you have a personal website, socials, or anything public as an author or anything like that?
sure, I do. Yeah. I contribute regularly to my blog. It's thescottsmithblog.com.
Okay.
I like to nerd out on biblical typology, and I've written Jonah. There's a lot on Jonah there already. Yeah,
Great.
pretty
Well,
cool.
wonderful. Well, yeah, I'll be sure to give it a read. And you also did a collaborative work with Father Donald Calloway, right?
Right. Yeah, that was a wonderful experience. Just working with Father Donald, it was a consecration to Saint Joseph for children and families. And
Okay.
that's and the Marian consecration for children, those are just wonderful things to do with your family, and especially it's a great means for the father to lead his children, to lead his family in prayer around the dinner table, which
Sure.
is that can heal a lot of problems in society if we can just get fathers leading their families in prayer.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Scott, thanks so much for sharing about near-death experiences. I'm glad you were fascinated by it, so much so to write this book and to really gift it to the Catholic world and people who will gravitate towards it. So thanks so much for joining me today and being my guest on Hey Everybody, it's Father Edward.
Thank you, Father.
If you liked today's episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're listening. And don't forget to stay up to date with what Father Edward is doing by following him on Facebook, X, or Instagram at the handle @FrEdwardLooney. Thanks for listening, and please join Father Edward again next time for another inspiring conversation.